The crack of gunfire echoed through the canyon as Morgan Whitley dragged his injured leg through the dust, his weathered face grimacing with each step toward the sound of desperate splashing in the river below. The year was 1878, and this remote stretch of Arizona territory had seen little but drought for months, making the sudden flash flood all the more treacherous for anyone caught unaware. Morgan had been tracking a small herd of wild mustangs when the storm hit, his prized quarter horse waiting patiently at his camp half a mile back. The leg that had plagued him since the war throbbed mercilessly as he scrambled down the embankment, spotting a woman's pale arms flailing against the churning current, her red hair visible for brief moments before disappearing beneath the surface again. "Hold on," he shouted, tearing off his worn leather vest and gun belt. Without hesitation, Morgan plunged into the frigid water, his bad leg nearly useless against the current. The cold shocked his system, but years of breaking horses had given him upper body strength few men could match. He fought against the pull of the water, reaching the woman just as she began to sink. Her eyes were closed, face pale as death, when Morgan hooked his arm around her waist and began the struggle back to shore. Each stroke against the current sent searing pain through his hip and down his leg, but he pushed forward, spitting water and cursing under his breath. "Not today," he growled, finally feeling his boots scrape against the riverbed. He dragged the woman's limp form onto the muddy bank, collapsing beside her. She wasn't breathing. Morgan rolled her onto her side, pounding her back with a firm hand until water gushed from her mouth and she began to cough violently. "That's it," he encouraged, supporting her as she gasped for air. "Breathe, miss." When she finally opened her eyes, they were the deepest green Morgan had ever seen, bright with life despite her near-death experience. She stared at him, confusion evident in her gaze. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Morgan nodded, suddenly aware of the throbbing pain in his leg. The exertion had aggravated his old injury, and he could feel fresh blood soaking through his worn denim pants. "Can you stand?" he asked, attempting to mask his discomfort. The woman nodded weakly and tried to rise, only to collapse back onto the muddy shore. "I think my ankle is broken," she admitted, grimacing. Morgan chuckled despite the situation. "Well, miss, it seems we make quite the pair. I don't suppose you can tell me what brought you to be swimming in a flash flood." "My wagon," she explained, gesturing weakly upstream. "The bridge washed out, my horse." Her voice broke. "I'm Morgan Whitley," he said, deciding introductions were overdue. "I've got a camp not far from here. Can get you dried off, look at that ankle." "Rebecca Evans," she replied, attempting a smile that transformed her face despite her bedraggled appearance. I was on my way to Copper Springs. The school there hired me as their new teacher." Morgan helped her to her feet, and they began the slow, painful journey toward his camp, each supporting the other's broken gait. It would take them nearly an hour to cover the distance that would normally require just minutes. By the time they reached his simple camp, night was falling, and Rebecca was shivering uncontrollably. Morgan stoked the fire and wrapped his spare blanket around her shoulders before tending to his horse. "You're bleeding," Rebecca observed, pointing to his leg as he returned to the fireside. Morgan shrugged. "Old war wound, acts up sometimes." "The Civil War?" she asked, her eyes curious. He nodded, settling across from her. "Confederate cavalry. Took a Union bullet at Chickamauga, never healed right." He didn't mention the months he'd spent in a prison camp afterward, where the wound had festered without proper treatment. "I need to look at that," Rebecca said with unexpected authority. "I may be a school teacher, but my father was a doctor. I learned a few things." Morgan opened his mouth to protest, but found himself rolling up his pant leg instead. The old wound was an angry red, with fresh bleeding around the edges. Years of limping had caused the muscles to waste away, leaving his right leg noticeably thinner than his left. Rebecca examined it with clinical detachment, her fingers gentle but precise. "This wasn't properly treated," she observed. "The bone healed wrong, that's why you limp." "Nothing to be done about it now," Morgan replied gruffly. She looked up, her green eyes determined. "I disagree, Mr. Whitley. With proper exercises and rehabilitation, you could walk much better, perhaps even without pain." Morgan laughed bitterly. "Been this way for 15 years, Miss Evans. Too late for miracles." "It's never too late," she replied firmly, "and I owe you my life." The least I can do is try to help you walk properly again." Morgan wanted to argue but found himself mesmerized by the conviction in her eyes. It had been a long time since anyone had shown genuine concern for him. Too long. "We should rest," he said instead. "Tomorrow I'll take you to Copper Springs." Rebecca nodded, settling closer to the fire. "Thank you, Mr. Whitley, for everything." As Morgan lay awake that night, listening to Rebecca's soft breathing across the fire, he wondered what twist of fate had sent her into that river. For 15 years, he'd kept mostly to himself, living off the land and occasionally breaking horses for local ranchers. He'd grown accustomed to solitude, to the pain that accompanied every step. The thought that someone, especially someone as lovely as Rebecca Evans, believed his condition could improve seemed almost cruelly hopeful. Morning came with clear skies, and no sign of yesterday's violent storm. Rebecca awoke to find Morgan already saddling his horse, his movements efficient despite his disability. "Your ankle," he said, noticing her watching him. "How is it?" Rebecca tested her weight gingerly. "Sore, but I don't believe it's broken after all, just a bad sprain." "Good. We'll ride double to town, should make it by midday." Rebecca approached him cautiously. "About what I said last night, no need," Morgan interrupted. "You were exhausted, grateful. People say things they don't mean." "I meant every word," she insisted. "My father specialized in war injuries. I assisted him for years before deciding to become a teacher. I know what I'm talking about, Mr. Whitley." Morgan paused, studying her face for any sign of pity. He found none, just the same determination he'd seen the night before. "Copper Springs first," he finally said. "You have a position waiting." The ride to town was awkward at first, with Rebecca seated sideways in front of him, her body tense against his chest. But as the miles passed, she relaxed, occasionally pointing out wildflowers or asking about landmarks. Morgan found himself answering her questions with more detail than he'd intended, describing the territory he'd come to know intimately over the years. "How long have you lived out here alone?" she asked as they crested a ridge that revealed the small mining town of Copper Springs in the valley below. "Since '68, Morgan replied. "Came west after the war, worked cattle drives for a few years. The leg made it hard to keep up, so I started breaking horses instead. Found I had a knack for it." "You have a gentle touch," Rebecca observed. "I noticed how you speak to your horse." Morgan felt unexpectedly warmed by her observation. Few people noticed such things about him. Copper Springs was bustling with activity when they arrived. The copper mine that gave the town its name had recently expanded operations, bringing new workers and their families. The school, Morgan knew, had been established just the previous year. He helped Rebecca down from the horse in front of the town's only hotel, acutely aware of the curious stares their arrival attracted. A woman riding double with the reclusive horse trainer was bound to start gossip. "Mr. Whitley, Miss Evans." The booming voice belonged to Harold Perkins, the town mayor and owner of the general store. He hurried toward them, his round face concerned. "We heard about the bridge washing out, feared the worst when you didn't arrive yesterday." "Mr. Whitley saved my life," Rebecca explained, briefly recounting her ordeal. The mayor beamed. "A hero. Well, Miss Evans, the school board is eager to meet you. They're gathered at my store now, waiting for news." Rebecca turned to Morgan. "Will you come with me?" "I'd like them to know exactly what you did." Morgan shifted uncomfortably. "Best I get back, got horses waiting." "Nonsense," the mayor insisted. "The town will want to thank you properly. Come, both of you." Morgan reluctantly allowed himself to be led to the general store, where the 5 members of the school board waited. Rebecca's account of her rescue earned him handshakes and backslaps, attention he'd avoided for years. "Where are your things, Miss Evans?" asked Mrs. Holloway, the banker's wife and head of the school board. Rebecca's face fell. "Lost in the river, I'm afraid. Everything I owned was in that wagon." This news caused a flurry of concern among the board members, who immediately began planning how to provide their new teacher with necessities. Morgan stood silently by the door, increasingly uncomfortable with the crowded room and constant chatter. "Mr. Whitley," Rebecca said suddenly, noticing his discomfort. "You're in pain, you should sit." The room quieted as all eyes turned to him, noticing for the first time the bloodstain on his pant leg. "It's nothing," he muttered, embarrassed. Dr. Samuel Jenkins, the town's physician and a school board member, approached with a professional eye. That doesn't look like nothing. Come to my office, let me take a look. Morgan started to refuse, but Rebecca caught his eye. The silent plea in her gaze somehow compelled him to comply. In the doctor's office, Morgan reluctantly allowed his leg to be examined again. Doctor. Jenkins, a former Army surgeon, whistled low at the sight of the old wound. Confederate cavalry, you said? He asked, probing gently. Morgan nodded. Chickamauga. I was at Gettysburg myself, Union Medical Corps. The doctor's touch was clinical but respectful. This healed all wrong. Bone fragments still in there, I'd wager. That's what I told him, Rebecca said from the doorway. I believe with proper treatment he could walk much better. Dr. Jenkins glanced between them. Miss Evans is right. Surgery to remove the fragments, followed by specific exercises. You'd never run a foot race, but you could walk without that limp and pain, Morgan scoffed. Surgery costs money, doctor, and time I don't have got horses to break. Consider it the town's payment for saving our new school teacher, Dr. Jenkins replied. As for time, well, those horses will wait. Morgan looked to Rebecca, whose hopeful expression made his protest die in his throat. 15 years of pain and limited mobility. Could it really be improved? I'd need somewhere to recover, he said finally. My camp's no place for that. The school has living quarters attached, Rebecca offered. I'll be staying there, but there's a small second bedroom. You could recover there and I could help with the exercises. It's settled then, Dr. Jenkins declared before Morgan could respond. We'll operate tomorrow morning. Tonight you'll stay at the hotel, my treat. That evening, as Morgan sat alone in his hotel room, a soft knock came at the door. He opened it to find Rebecca standing there, her red hair now clean and styled, wearing a borrowed blue dress. I wanted to check on you, she said. And to thank you again. Morgan stepped back to allow her entry, suddenly conscious of his simple room and his own rough appearance. No need for more thanks. Rebecca sat in the room's only chair while Morgan perched awkwardly on the edge of the bed. I've spoken with the school board, she said. They've agreed to delay the start of classes by 2 weeks so I can help with your recovery. Morgan frowned. You don't need to do that. I want to, she insisted. Mr. Whitley Morgan, when I was drowning, I saw my life flash before my eyes. Do you know what I regretted most? All the times I was too afraid to make a difference. Her green eyes held his steadily. I won't miss this chance. Please let me help you. Something in her earnest gaze broke through Morgan's carefully constructed defenses. For 15 years, he'd accepted his disability as punishment for surviving when so many others hadn't. The possibility of improvement had never seemed real until now. All right, he conceded, but only because it seems I won't get any peace otherwise. Rebecca's smile was radiant. You won't regret it, I promise. The surgery the next morning was painful but successful. Dr. Jenkins extracted 3 bullet fragments that had been lodged near Morgan's hip joint for 15 years. The relief, the doctor promised, would be significant once the surgical pain subsided. Morgan was moved to the small bedroom in the schoolhouse quarters afterward. The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the schoolyard. Rebecca proved to be an attentive nurse, changing his bandages and ensuring he took the medicinal powders doctor. Jenkins prescribed for pain. By the 3rd day, Morgan was restless. I need to check on my horse, he insisted, attempting to rise from the bed. Rebecca blocked his path, arms crossed. Your horse is fine. Mr. Perkins' son is caring for him at the livery. You need to rest. I've been resting for 3 days, Morgan grumbled. And you'll rest 3 more before we begin exercises, she replied firmly. Doctor's orders. To pass the time, Rebecca began reading to him from the schoolbooks she'd been given to replace those lost in the flood. Morgan had little formal education, having left school at 12 to work his father's farm, and he found himself surprisingly engaged by the history and literature she shared. In the evenings, they played checkers or simply talked. Morgan gradually revealed pieces of his past, his Tennessee childhood, the horror of the war, his difficult years drifting westward. Rebecca spoke of her own life in Ohio, her father's medical practice, and her decision to venture west for a teaching position after both parents died of influenza. I needed a fresh start, she explained one evening as twilight bathed the room in soft golden light. Somewhere I could be more than just the doctor's daughter. Morgan studied her face, noting the strength beneath her delicate features. "You're braver than most men I know coming out here alone." Rebecca laughed softly. "Not brave enough to survive that river without help." "We all need help sometimes," Morgan replied, surprising himself with the admission. 6 days after the surgery, Dr. Jenkins declared Morgan ready to begin rehabilitation. Rebecca had prepared a detailed regimen of exercises based on her father's methods, starting with simple movements to restore strength to the atrophied muscles. "Straighten your leg," she instructed, kneeling beside the bed. "Now raise it slowly, hold and lower." Morgan grimaced with the effort but complied. The pain was different now, not the sharp, burning sensation he'd lived with for years, but the healthy strain of unused muscles being awakened. "Good," Rebecca praised. Again, each day the exercises grew more challenging. Rebecca was a patient but demanding teacher, never allowing Morgan to give less than his best effort. Within a week, he was walking short distances with the aid of a cane, marveling at the gradual reduction in pain. "The muscles are remembering," Rebecca explained as she massaged a salve into his leg one evening. "Your body wants to heal, it just needed the proper chance." Morgan watched her hands work, her touch both clinical and somehow intimate. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked suddenly. Rebecca's hands paused briefly before continuing their methodical movement. "I told you I owe you my life. You've more than repaid that debt," Morgan insisted. "Most folks would have moved on by now." Rebecca sat back, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Perhaps I see something worth investing in," she said quietly. "A good man who deserves a better life than pain with every step." Their eyes met, and Morgan felt something shift between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been growing since that day at the river. Before he could respond, a knock at the door broke the moment. Mrs. Holloway entered with a basket of baked goods. "How is our patient progressing?" she asked cheerfully. "Very well," Rebecca replied, her professional demeanor returning. "We're hoping for a short walk outside tomorrow." "Wonderful. The whole town is talking about your remarkable recovery, Mr. Whitley. And Miss Evans, the children are so excited for school to begin next week." Morgan watched as Rebecca discussed her teaching plans with Mrs. Holloway, noting how her face lit up when she spoke of the students. She belonged here, he realized. This town needed her brightness, her determination. And when school began, their daily sessions would end. The thought troubled him more than he cared to admit. The following day brought Morgan's first venture outside since the surgery. Leaning on both Rebecca and a walking stick, he made a slow circuit of the schoolyard. The fresh air and sunshine lifted his spirits despite the strain of walking. "How does it feel?" Rebecca asked as they paused beneath a cottonwood tree. "Different," Morgan admitted. "Stronger." He tested his weight on the leg. "The pain is mostly gone." Rebecca beamed with genuine pleasure at his progress. "By next week, you'll be walking to the general store alone, and you'll be teaching," Morgan observed. "Your real work." Rebecca's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, but we'll continue your exercises in the evenings. You're not fully recovered yet." Morgan nodded, though he wondered what would happen when he was. His camp seemed increasingly distant, not just in miles but in time, like something from another life. As predicted, Morgan progressed rapidly. By the time Rebecca began teaching the following week, he could walk comfortably with only a slight limp, using the walking stick more from habit than necessity. Each evening, after her school duties were complete, Rebecca would lead him through more advanced exercises designed to strengthen his leg further. Morgan found himself lingering in town, offering to repair the schoolhouse roof and build new shelves for Rebecca's growing collection of donated books. He began breaking horses for local ranchers at the town livery, earning enough to pay for his extended stay and contribute to the school's needs. The townsfolk, initially wary of the reclusive horse trainer, gradually accepted his presence. Children would gather to watch him work with wild mustangs, marveling at his ability to gentle the most spirited animals. "You're good with them," Rebecca observed one Saturday, watching from the corral fence as Morgan worked with a particularly difficult bay stallion. "You have patience." Morgan guided the horse in a careful circle, maintaining gentle pressure on the lead rope. "Animals respond to consistency. They need to know what to expect." "Like children," Rebecca agreed. "My students are finally settling into a routine." Even young Tommy Peters is staying in his seat most of the day. Morgan smiled, remembering the rambunctious boy who had once asked why his teacher lived with the limping horse man. The question had embarrassed Rebecca, but amused Morgan. "I should return to my camp soon," he said, the thought suddenly occurring to him. "Been imposing on your kindness too long." Rebecca's expression fell. "You're not imposing, your help with the school repairs has been invaluable." Still, Morgan persisted, unsure why he was pushing the issue when the last thing he wanted was to leave. "People will talk." Rebecca's chin lifted defiantly. "Let them, I don't care what people say," but Morgan knew she should care. A school teacher's reputation was everything, especially in a small town like Copper Springs. His continued presence in the attached living quarters could only lead to gossip, despite the propriety they'd maintained. That evening, as they shared a simple dinner, Morgan broached the subject again. "I'm thinking of building a proper cabin, north of town by Cedar Creek." Rebecca set down her fork. "You're staying in the area, seems like a good place to settle," he replied, watching her reaction carefully. "Town's growing, need for horse training will only increase." "That's wonderful news," Rebecca said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Cedar Creek is lovely." Morgan took a deep breath. "I thought maybe you might come visit when it's built, continue our evening talks." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. "I'd like that." The conversation shifted to other topics, but something had changed between them, an unspoken possibility hanging in the air. The following Sunday, Rebecca persuaded Morgan to accompany her to church services. It would be his first attendance since arriving in Copper Springs, and he felt uncomfortably conspicuous as they entered the simple wooden building together. Reverend Taylor, a young minister with progressive ideas, welcomed Morgan warmly. "It's good to see you, Mr. Whitley. Miss Evans has told me about your remarkable recovery." "Thanks to her," Morgan acknowledged, acutely aware of the curious glances from the congregation. The service passed pleasantly enough, with Reverend Taylor delivering a thoughtful sermon on second chances. Afterward, as the congregants gathered outside to socialize, Morgan found himself drawn into conversations with ranchers interested in his horse-breaking services. Rebecca stood a short distance away, chatting with several mothers of her students. Morgan couldn't help noticing how she occasionally glanced his way, a soft smile playing on her lips when their eyes met. "You should marry that girl," said a gruff voice beside him. Morgan turned to find Old Man Jenkins, the doctor's father and the town's oldest resident, watching him with knowing eyes. "Excuse me," Morgan replied, startled by the blunt statement. "Don't play dumb, son. I've seen how you look at each other." The old man chuckled. "When you get to my age, you don't waste time dancing around the obvious." Morgan shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Evans deserves better than a broken-down ex-Confederate with half a leg," Old Man Jenkins snorted. "Doesn't look broken down to me, and seems to me she's already decided what she deserves." He nodded toward Rebecca, who was now approaching them. "Don't be a fool, son. Good women like that don't come along every day." The old man wandered off as Rebecca reached Morgan's side. "What was that about?" she asked, watching Jenkins' retreating form. "Just offering some unsolicited advice," Morgan replied. "About horses. About life." That evening, as they walked slowly back to the schoolhouse, Morgan found himself contemplating Jenkins' words. The past 2 months had transformed him in ways he'd never anticipated. Not just his leg, which now supported him with only minimal discomfort, but his outlook, his willingness to engage with others, to consider a future beyond solitary existence. And at the center of that transformation was Rebecca, whose determination had given him back possibilities he'd long abandoned. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, breaking his reverie. Morgan hesitated, then decided truth was required. "I was thinking about how much has changed since I pulled you from that river." Rebecca nodded. "For me as well. I came here expecting to find purpose in teaching, but I found so much more." They reached the schoolhouse steps and paused. The autumn evening was cool, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Rebecca," Morgan said, his voice unusually uncertain, "I need to ask you something." Her green eyes studied his face. "Yes, when I build that cabin, would you consider sharing it as my wife?" The words hung between them, Morgan's heart pounding as he waited for her response. Rebecca's eyes widened, then filled with unexpected tears. "I've offended you," he said quickly. "Forgive me, I shouldn't have no," Rebecca interrupted, reaching for his hand. "These aren't sad tears. I just never imagined. When I was drowning that day, I thought my life was ending. I never dreamed it was actually beginning." Morgan's breath caught. "Is that a yes?" Rebecca's smile was radiant. "Yes, Morgan Whitley, I will share your cabin and your life." Morgan pulled her gently into his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. When their lips met, it felt like the culmination of a journey that had begun the moment he'd spotted her red hair in that churning river. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Copper Springs. To Morgan's surprise, it was met with near universal approval. The school board, after initial concerns about losing their teacher, agreed that Rebecca could continue teaching after marriage, a progressive stance that reflected the town's growing modernity. Morgan began construction on their cabin immediately, hiring 2 local men to help with the larger tasks. Rebecca visited the site each afternoon after school, offering suggestions and planning the garden she would plant come spring. "We should have a proper wedding before winter sets in," she said one evening as they reviewed the cabin's progress. "November, perhaps," Morgan nodded, still sometimes disbelieving his good fortune. "Whatever you want." "What I want," Rebecca said, taking his hand, "is for you to stop looking at me like I might disappear. I'm not going anywhere, Morgan." He squeezed her hand. 15 years of solitude makes a man cautious about happiness. And a near drowning makes a woman embrace it fully, she countered. "We balance each other." Their wedding took place on a crisp November morning, with the entire town in attendance. Reverend Taylor performed the ceremony in the church decked with late-blooming wildflowers gathered by Rebecca's students. Morgan stood straight and tall beside his bride, using his walking stick more for ceremony than necessity. When they exchanged vows, Morgan's voice was steady and sure. The words "in sickness and in health" held particular meaning for them both, a promise already tested and proven. The cabin was completed just in time, with the community coming together to raise the final walls and roof in a traditional building B. It stood on a gentle rise overlooking Cedar Creek, close enough to town for Rebecca's daily teaching duties, but far enough for privacy. Their first night in their new home, Morgan built a fire in the stone hearth while Rebecca arranged their few belongings. The cabin was simple but solid, with 2 rooms and a small lean-to kitchen. Morgan had taken particular care with the details: smooth, planed floors that wouldn't catch Rebecca's skirts, windows positioned to capture both morning and afternoon light. "It's perfect," Rebecca declared, joining him by the fire. "Our own place." Morgan drew her into his arms, still marveling at the right to do so. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted. "A home, a wife, a future worth planning for." "All because of a flash flood," Rebecca mused. "All because you believed I could walk again when I'd given up," Morgan corrected her. "You gave me back more than my leg, Rebecca." She rose on tiptoes to kiss him. "And you gave me life, twice over. Once when you pulled me from the river, and again when you asked me to share yours." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the new roof of their cabin. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, Morgan Whitley held his wife close, his steps toward her unfaltering and true. 6 months later, as spring transformed the landscape around Cedar Creek, Morgan stood at the edge of their thriving vegetable garden, watching Rebecca tend the young plants. His limp was now barely perceptible, the walking stick relegated to a hook by the door used only on the coldest days when old injuries ached with remembered pain. Rebecca straightened, one hand moving to the small swell of her belly, their first child, due in the autumn. She smiled when she saw him watching. "What are you thinking about, husband?" she called, removing her gardening gloves. Morgan crossed to her, his gait strong and steady. "I'm thinking that when our child learns to walk, I'll be able to show him how." Rebecca's eyes shone with understanding of all that simple statement meant. "Yes," she said softly, taking his hand and placing it on her belly. "And what a wonderful teacher you'll be." Together they walked back toward their cabin, each step a testament to healing, to second chances, and to the unexpected currents that sometimes sweep lives together against all odds.